Welcome back to Drafting the Past, a podcast about the craft of writing history. I am Kate Carpenter, your host, and today I'm joined by writer and historian Dr. Rebecca Brenner Graham.
Thank you so much for having me, Kate.
Rebecca is a postdoctoral research associate at Brown University, and before that she taught high school history, an experience we talk a lot more about in this episode. Her first book is out now. It's called Dear Miss Perkins, a story of Frances Perkins' efforts to aid refugees from Nazi Germany. And it is not only a compelling history, but holds valuable lessons for readers now. I also asked Rebecca to dig into her approach for publicizing a recently released book, and I think her advice will be a big help for other authors. Enjoy my conversation with Dr. Rebecca Brenner Graham.
My career has been focused on history. When I was in middle school, I wanted to be a middle school history teacher. When I was in high school, I wanted to be a high school history teacher. When I was in college, I wanted to be a college history professor. Many people told me that that was not an option for 99% of people. So then I adjusted and wanted to work a different job in history. So when I went to graduate school, public history master's and PhD in history, I thought I wanted to be a federal historian, like a historian of federal topics in the US, maybe employed somewhere in DC. And at some point during graduate school, as the academic blogs took off and I had the experience of writing in various places, I became obsessed with writing as much as I am obsessed with history. So I think that I've primarily aspired to be a writer for like 5 or 6 years now. And for me, it's all history.
Well, let's talk about kind of how that looks day to day. So when and where do you like to do your writing?
When I was writing my book, I was teaching high school history full time. And so my writing schedule looked like a combination of 500 words at maybe a bar. Like I don't drink much, eating food but at a bar after work. And then I would aim for 1,000 words per day on the weekends, especially closer to the deadline. Also, I would write during the day at work. Like if my students were taking an in-class essay, well, I was writing too. And if I had a free block, I would position myself sometimes on a comfortable chair in like the room where the copier was, so that all the kind encouraging teachers would come in and ask me how my writing was going, and I would tell them, and that would just encourage me and propel me forward. But that was all while I was writing Dear Miss Perkins. And then a couple months after finishing writing the book, I applied and got a new job as a postdoc at Brown. And now I'm still figuring out my routines here. And a lot of them involve airplanes and trains to other places. I love writing while on the go.
What kind of tools do you like to use to organize yourself?
My organization of writing is poor, I think. So I use Microsoft Word. Sometimes I tend to outline in a Google Doc, but then write on Microsoft Word. There's really not a good organization of either. I mean, a highlight, or one might call it a low point of the organization of my research while I was writing Dear Miss Perkins, was one day in the archives in June 2023. I was feeling particularly down about something from my day job, and I literally labeled each document in my scanning app based on how many hours till therapy, because I had virtual therapy. I did good research that day. I literally had to take another whole day to redo that research so that I could cite properly where the documents were from, because I had literally labeled documents 4 hours till therapy, 3 hours till therapy. So I am not someone, I have not used Zotero before. I have not used Scrivener before. I'm aware that they exist. I might have the worst organization out of all the history writers.
Oh, I don't know if that's true. Although everyone thinks that's true of them. It sounds like you write mostly digitally rather than by hand. What does your revision process look like?
Yes, with very few exceptions, I write digitally rather than by hand. I'm a very fast typer. I see that as one of my great privileges in life. Revision for me involves many other people. So while I was writing my book, my partner at the time was the first edit on everything, and the book's dedicated to him. And I think he's a very talented editor, Brandon. He is not an academic, and I always found that that was really helpful. And then I would incorporate his edits sometimes in conversation with him. He still edits my work too. And then most chapters went next to my writing group from the U.S. Intellectual History Society. Tim Lacey, Lauren Lesab Shepard, who was one of your guests on the show, and Katie Hull often edit my drafts after they've been through Brandon. And then the series of scholarly interlocutors continues, and I'm a very social person and editor. My revision process is typically a social event, except there were definitely times, some of the hardest parts of my book to write, I would print them out and edit on paper. I specifically remember I was also an adjunct on the side at American University, which is where I did my PhD. And so I had printing privileges there. And so sometimes, like on a summer day or a weekend day, I would metro from Arlington, Virginia to American University, use their printer, and then edit on paper, probably at the Guapos Bar in Tenleytown, Washington, D.C.
I love that. So when you get feedback from all these people and you have kind of all of their notes, practically speaking, like how do you incorporate that? Do you make a big list for yourself? Do you, I don't know, cry? That's what I do.
I go one edit by edit in the document itself. So, for example, when my partner Brandon would send me a document back, I would take his document and I would relabel it. There's a lot of relabeling in my documents. I guess the joke is that we all have so many files that are like last final draft again, one. And that's very much what my filing system looks like. So I'll relabel it. From him, I usually accept all edits with very few exceptions. And then we continue from there.
So I'm curious, this book that we're talking about today is a different subject than your dissertation topic, if I'm reading that correctly. What sort of prompted the switch? What were you thinking and what was that like?
My dissertation was on American 19th century religion-state relations through the lens of postal history. I came to that topic. I wanted to do early U.S. I wanted to do church-state relations. It ended up being broader and about postal history. And all of those decisions were very academic and in an academic context. So when I defended my dissertation in August 2021, I had a conversation with an editor at Academic Press that I was genuinely excited about, that I really thought I was going to go forward on that path at the time of defense. Dissertation defense. However, I have always had a very strong interest in how many audiences consume history. Like I did a public history master's and I've read widely in nonfiction for as long as I can remember. Definitely was a nonfiction reader as a child. And I just increasingly had this strong interest in writing a trade book. But the reason that I actually switched to the topic of Frances Perkins's refugee policy was that it had been my undergraduate thesis, and it was not a part of my life during graduate school, with a few exceptional moments. I actually wrote about this topic for Made by History at the Washington Post twice, just because there were news stories that were really relevant to it. And I wrote for Made by History from my dissertation other times too, but it did give me the opportunity to return to Frances Perkins. And then shortly after my dissertation defense, I was walking through a Barnes & Noble. I came across a book that was tangentially related, like literally a side character in my book was married to someone who was in the book that I walked by at Barnes & Noble. And I was flipping through the footnotes and the index, and it occurred to me, why am I looking at the footnotes and index of a project that has not been my daily life or responsibility at this point for 6 years? And it literally hit me while walking in Barnes & Noble. I still care about this a lot, and maybe I can do something with that. But that was like September 2021. I did not decide for sure to do it until November 2021. I remember it was while I was on vacation in Paris, and specifically was sitting at a Hard Rock Cafe when I actually decided to do it. And then I was really working on the proposal and also reading additional books about how to do a book proposal for trade press, not an academic press, by spring 2022. And then I did have my contract by the end of the calendar year 2022.
Tell me a little bit about what it was like to write a proposal and find an agent for this book.
First, I read a few books about it. I read Thinking Like Your Editor. And then my favorite is called Before and After the Book Deal by Courtney Mom. That book has a section title that's like, Whether You Should Cry in the Corner. And it was just so informative. I started by editing one of the chapters from my undergraduate thesis. My undergraduate thesis had 3 chapters. The first one, I edited it significantly, but the flow of it really made it all the way into the book. The other 2 completely rewritten, like basically unusable. The research was usable, but not the writing from back in the day. And the proposal, I've actually never done an academic proposal, so I don't even know exactly how it's different. I think that it has historiography, whereas the trade press does not. But the trade press proposal has things like comp titles, which is really not competition. It's really examples of why is this book doing well in the publishing landscape right now. It also has a synopsis. It has a publicity plan where you say things like, and the people that would buy socks with Frances Perkins's face on them at Politics and Prose would buy my book too. And I tried to stick pretty closely to those publicity plans after I finished writing the book and as I'm going through with the launch process right now. That's what the proposal looked like for me. The first audience for my proposal was querying an agent. So that was another part of why it took almost a year to go from idea to contract.
Once you had established a relationship with an agent, did you have to do a lot more work on the proposal?
I had sent 1 chapter to her, and in order to go on submission, we needed 3. So I had this 1 chapter, which is chapter 4, charge bonds. That's the one that stayed the closest to how it was originally. And then when I had COVID in May 2022, I guess what my true inner self really wanted to do while I was delirious was to rewrite my visas chapter. The rewritten visas chapter was in the proposal. So to be clear, this is the one I wrote while I had COVID over the course of a few days. Completely rewritten for the book. What I wrote when I had COVID is not in the book. It was also totally unusable. And then that summer in 2022, my agent, Danny Siegelbaum, who's wonderful, she said that I basically had to have the chapter 1, Becoming Frances Perkins, because otherwise a reader would be like, who is this person? Why do I care? And so I did write that biographical chapter. And to be honest, chapter 1 is probably my least favorite chapter because I think that my writing improved while I was writing the book. So if listeners start to read it, keep going.
To take a closer look at Rebecca's writing in this book, I asked her to read an excerpt from chapter 6, Resolution to Impeach Frances Perkins. Here's Dr. Rebecca Brenner Graham reading from Dear Miss Perkins.
At the Columbia University Rare Book and Manuscript Library, the archival folder that holds Perkins's hate mail is a fascinating place. From 1938 to 1939, she received a slew of hate mail from people who hated Bridges and her, thought she was a communist, or some combination of those. Many pieces of hate mail called her Jewish, though she was a practicing Episcopalian. One commonality in the hate mail was that very few of them got her name right, and most seemed to do so intentionally. Remember that Perkins had carefully chosen her name. As a 20-something, she switched her first name to Frances, like the saint. When she married Paul Wilson in her 30s, she strategically chose to remain Frances Perkins professionally. As the first female cabinet secretary at age 52, she chose to go by Miss Perkins, or more formally, Madam Secretary. As usually the only woman in the room, she navigated complicated gender politics for men around her to see her as something other than another man's wife. In the 1930s, she couldn't be fully seen as a professional and Paul Wilson's wife in many colleagues' eyes, so she chose the professional. They needed to see her as a colleague so that Perkins could do the important work that she came to Washington to accomplish. As if on cue, most of the hate mail called her Mrs. Perkins, Mr. Paul Wilson, Miss or Mrs. Perkins, or other carelessly construed variations. One letter opens, Mrs. Perkins. Why do you not go by your married name? Or are you really married in the eyes of God? ! No wonder you take the side of the Reds, you low-down child murderess. Read the attached, then hang your dirty, immoral head. The author of this piece of hate mail proceeded to construct an illogical and unsound argument. He rambled. If, for instance, I want your job and your possessions, I can go take same, and according to you and Russia's way of thinking, there is no God, consequently, to whom do I have to give an accounting? He added that the quicker we blow your ass up into bits, the better for this government. Don't say this is nasty, as there is no such thing as anything being wrong or right. Before pivoting quickly to an argument for more Christianity in public schools. Essentially, he rambled that Perkins had no morals. He used his own premise of no morals to threaten assassination, and then he prescribed a solution: religious instruction back in the schools.
Amazing. So talk to me about what went into writing this passage.
My trip to the Columbia University archives took place during spring break in March 2023. And I was finishing the writing of, I think, chapter 2 while I was in New York, but I was researching what would become chapter 6. So by the time I got back to school at my day job, I had a lot of research and I was gearing up to write. And I remember the morning I got back from spring break, my colleague Larry Pratt, we taught U.S. history together. And he's a career-long teacher, and just at an all-girls school, like his whole career is empowering and teaching women to value their own thoughts. And so Larry and I would always collaborate in the mornings because we were both morning people. And he asked me about spring break. And I told him about those files. And we had a whole conversation about them. And the section title is Greetings to the Red Paint, because Larry thought that that was hilarious and compelling. And the first line of that section is that the hate mail is a fascinating place. I think that's literally something that I said to Larry when he asked how my spring break was. Well, I went to this archival folder and it was fascinating. And so the way I explained everything to Larry and the examples that I chose from memory really found their way into the text. I mentioned earlier that I would do like 500 word sprints, typically at a bar while eating like a burger, not much of a drinker, after work. And I remember where I was when I was writing a lot of that passage. It was Capitol Burger in downtown DC.
You mentioned ahead of this that this was one of your favorite chapters. Is that why, or were there other things that made this chapter so fun?
And fun, the whole book was fun for me, honestly. And most of the story is sad, so like I don't want to call it fun. But one of the reasons I like this chapter is because it pulls together research from many different archives. Because the resolution to impeach her left documents in her personal correspondence and the federal correspondence. And I think one other place, the letter where she arranged for it to be publicized that she had written to a friend that she was not Jewish, but if she was, she would be proud. Well, that's at the FDR library. So then that's another location. It felt like I was piecing together different strands and that they converged here. It might be the most important chapter argumentatively in the book, because I argue that she came in with these hopes and dreams about what the U.S. could be. And then at this highest position in Frances Perkins' career, she learned primarily through the impeachment resolution, but through other experiences as well, that the U.S. doesn't really work like that. And actually, it's pretty frustrating and sad.
As the title of the book itself suggests, you feature a lot of correspondence, of course, in this book. It's called Dear Miss Perkins. And these are not only sources, but they're really sort of like a key part of her work was corresponding with people. What were some of the challenges of working with so much correspondence?
Some mechanical challenges. Sometimes they're not dated. Sometimes they're not directed to a specific person. Sometimes they're not organized well within the folders, mostly from the National Archives. But overall, my real answer to your question is that correspondence is my comfort zone. I think for writing about historical correspondence, and everyone has their comfort zones. Like for some people, it's, I don't know, business records or even objects. But correspondence for me as like a text heavy reader and thinker, it has a natural flow to it, a back and forth. Like he said, then she said, then she told him this, and then this is how it happens. And we read that from correspondence too. The title is Dear Miss Perkins because the archival backbone of my undergraduate thesis were these documents at the National Archives at College Park where she was corresponding with people on behalf of refugees. And throughout my senior thesis process back in the day, over a decade ago now, the title was The Efforts of Frances Perkins's No, sorry, it was so bad that I can't even remember. It was Frances Perkins's Efforts to Aid Refugees from Nazi Germany. That was the title. And it wasn't till the very last week of the senior thesis process that I had, a tough love conversation from my advisor at the time, Jeremy King at Mount Holyoke. And I was in tears for who knows. And while I was crying, I thought of the title Dear Miss Perkins. And many people in the publishing process are interested in reevaluating the title. Well, neither my agent nor my editor nor the publishing company changed the title. It's been Dear Miss Perkins since 2015. And I will add, a few days ago before we recorded, Frances Perkins's last descendant, Tomlin Coggeshall, died. And so I was searching in my email correspondence for like the last things that he said to me. Well, Tomlin complimented the title specifically. And to be honest, I feel very proud of that.
One of the things that I'm really curious, as you've mentioned in this interview, is that you were teaching high school, among other things that you were doing for a lot of the time that you were working on this book. And I'm wondering how that impacted the way you wrote. Both, I mean, practically, of course, but also the way you thought about writing this book.
Yes, if I can find it quickly. I write toward the end of my acknowledgments. Rather than writing this book despite teaching full-time at the Madeira School, I wrote this book because of teaching full-time at the Madeira School, and I really, really stand by that. And it's for a few reasons. The first is my students. Anyone who teaches knows that you have to be accessible. You have to make history seem relevant. You have to hold their attention because they don't give you a choice. They taught me to explain things, hopefully in interesting ways, and also to engage in conversation with them. Also, my colleagues, as I've mentioned probably several times in this conversation, were just incredible. And not in a formal way, like in a very informal, cared about me and this project while I was working on it. And the boarding school where I worked at, it was just so small. There were even times that if one of my colleagues was teaching a research seminar and it happened to overlap with my free block, it would be like, why is Dr. Graham here? Like I would just be sitting in the research seminar with like the 12th graders who were trying to hammer out their 12 pages so they could graduate. And I focus best when I'm around other people who are focusing. So that was very helpful. In addition to my students and the teachers, there's also the structure of the day and the structure of the year. I did most of my writing and research during spring break, summer break. I probably wrote half of my manuscript in summer 2023 over the course of, it was 10 weeks, but it was really 9 weeks because that last week is spent prepping for the upcoming school year. And I wrote the last chapter and the introduction during our week-long Thanksgiving break in fall 2023. I got lucky, I think, that we had longer breaks because it was a boarding school, so there needed to be time for the students to go home.
One thing I think a lot of people don't realize is how hard authors have to work to sell their own books after they're published. I think there's sort of like a dream that the book goes out in the world and people just find it and everyone is happy. And I'm wondering, especially as someone who has focused on writing for a more public audience, who has loved and dreamed of writing I've seen the really hard work you're doing to get the word out about the book. What has that process been like? Has it affected the way you think of being an author at all?
Well, first, thank you so much for being a part of it. Like, I pitched Drafting in the Past, and if you were to look at the notes app on my phone, it was like a high priority for me. And I'm just so grateful to be here. I'll give you the full behind the scenes. After I decided to switch from Madeira to Brown, I still had a few months of teaching at Madeira, plus I was preparing for a move. Right after the school year ended, that was when I started working on what you called publicity. And I think, you know how people who are actually good at networking view it as genuinely making friends? That's how I approached reaching out to bookstores and publications and anyone who wants to be part of the Dear Miss Perkins community. I think I have been really shameless about it, and it's because it's truly not about me. Like, Frances Perkins Center is going to be a National Park Service site. That has nothing to do with me. She's actually on the rise as an icon, and there's a lot that we can learn from her during this moment. Also, the other strands of the book, American Responses to Nazism and Immigration Policy, are both really important. And maybe I'm being delusional, but I honestly have not felt like I was promoting myself, though, of course, I do benefit from it professionally. So to go back to June 2024, I started by walking into bookstores and introducing myself. And like, I will stand by that method. So when I'm emailing the people who work there, they can picture me. Like, I can picture Nicole at Politics and Prose and Megan at Lost City and Megan at People's Book. And one of the Megans has an H and the other one does not. So then I moved to Rhode Island and I started doing the same thing up here. And as the ball got rolling, then the publicist at my publisher, Kensington, her name is Ann Pryor, then she also started pitching events. So once you get a few, it's easier to get more. My initial goal for events was 10. I hit 10 maybe in the early fall. And then I told myself that after 20, I would stop pitching them. It is currently up to 33.
Wow.
And many of them pay me. Many of them were reaches for me. A point that I really want to emphasize is that so many of the ones I pitched were rejections, and that's a good thing. I mean, I won't name names just out of respect, but like, there are multiple high-profile bookstores that I pitched wholeheartedly, and they either didn't respond or told my publicist no. And that's good. That's part of the process. So in mid-fall, I shifted my energy from events to publications. And October, November, December, I drafted several essays that were either edited excerpts or they were just essay offshoots from the book. And I'm very grateful. I think that all of them have found a home. And this is like 7 or 8 pieces. And then I had a few other opportunities approach me, like a few profiles, and those will all be coming out. So a lot of my writing energy over the past few months has gone into promotion. Maybe I'm being delusional, but I honestly don't think of it that way. I think of it as exercising the writing muscle, which I love and enjoy. And also, it's like studying this book that I finished writing in December 2023. Like, I need to remember everything that happens in it. And so the essay writing process has been really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you sharing so much, because I think that, it's actually a really important part of the writing and publishing life, and one that kind of gets overlooked or, just talked about amongst authors when they're in it, but is kind of foreign to people.
I also got really lucky a couple times. I mean, you and I are probably around the same generation of scholars, right? And I think that the generation above us, well, they learned that there's no jobs, but they also learned that they have to hustle and do a lot of the publicity work themselves. I had several author friends tell me that they expected more to happen on its own, and it didn't. One in particular, I reviewed her book for an outlet, and without naming the name of this person or the name of the publisher, they said they apologized to me profusely that their publisher did not send me a final copy of the book after I reviewed the advanced copy. And some of those details inevitably fall through the cracks because everyone is busy and overworked and overwhelmed. But I was really lucky to get a sense from several other people that you have to keep up on things by yourself as an author, no matter how amazing the team is. And my team is amazing. I've been very lucky.
I want to kind of switch gears for the last part of our time here and talk a little bit about your inspirations. Are there other authors or books that you look to for inspiration or other forms of media?
Around the time that I switched from writing academically to trade press, there were a few specific authors that I really, really looked up to how they channeled their academic expertise toward creative nonfiction. And that's Anne Helen Peterson, who is a media studies academic who has written about all sorts of culture. She has a Substack called Culture Study, and she'll take seriously Taylor Swift, American Girl dolls. Like, she just has such a wide range. Tressie McMillan Cottom is another one. Her essay collection book called Thick, I used to make undergraduates read it in a history class, even though she's a sociologist. She's just so smart. I mean, so many of her essays are so good. I particularly loved her essay on Sephora, the store, in which maybe it's not on Sephora, maybe that's just the detail that stands out to me. But basically, her argument is that yes, the beauty industry is misogynistic, and it's also a weapon that white women have to have whiteness. And it's just so smart and rooted in research, but just deeply applicable to daily life. And then Samantha Rose Hill is a PhD political scientist who is a narrative nonfiction philosophy writer. I think I've been very inspired by both her writing and her career, because she takes her academic training and then she's sort of like, I'm going to do what I want with it. And she's also all over the place all the time geographically. And I think that that is my nature as well. And then most recently, the last writer I have here on this mini list is Becca Rothfeld, who is an academically trained philosopher. She is a nonfiction critic at the Washington Post, and she's like an award-winning book reviewer. I love her book reviews. And I also love her first book, All Things Are Too Small, in which every chapter feels like she's critiquing something by eating it alive, but like also enjoying it at the same time. So those are some of my inspirations as writers. Anyone might have picked up on, none of those people are PhD historians. That's not because I don't find inspiration from them. It's because I'm so lucky that I know so many PhD historians and love them deeply as people that I could not choose a few.
That's fair. What's the most influential writing advice you've ever gotten?
When people ask me this, which has happened a few times, I have said, go to therapy. But what I really mean by that is work with your brain, not against it. And I think that your show does a really great job of demonstrating that there are countless correct ways to go about being a writer of history.
Well, I'm curious, now that you're at Brown as a postdoc rather than teaching high school, what's kind of your vision for your career going forward? Are you focused on writing and writing in a public audience? Are you kind of turning back toward the academic track? What does that look like for you?
The short answer is I'm not sure. Here are some of my thoughts. I love my job currently. I am so grateful for it. I'm sure there's a huge overlap between your listeners and people who know and look up to Karen Wolf. Well, she's one of my supervisors, and I just texted her this morning, like, I'm really nervous for this podcast because it's one of my favorites. I'll be back in a few hours. And she's like, you've got this. That's great. Like, I could not have done that as a high school history teacher. I could not have told my students, I'll be back in a few hours. Like, that's so it's been a huge change for me. And with that said, I ended up as a postdoc academically. I was not looking to go back into academia. If I end up somehow back in academia, it will be by accident. I don't look like, even if I've never applied for a tenure track job. Maybe I will. I don't know. I wouldn't count it out. I think I'm good at teaching, and there are many aspects of it that I like. I love writing, but I'm also an extrovert who benefits from working through my ideas in a social manner, not in isolation. right now I'm obsessed with writing. Like I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, that's been it for me for a few years. And whatever enables me to do that while also engaging in a history community, there's not one singular job that I'm tied to. And what I tell, it's not like people ask me all the time for career advice. I mean, I'm not all the way far along, but it does happen sometimes. And typically what I tell them is that we've witnessed that the rules don't work. There used to be a path that if you had a peer-reviewed article and a book under contract, you would likely get a tenure-track job. That doesn't work. It used to be if you have a certain graduate degree, you might get some job in a museum. That also may or may not happen. And I believe that because those rules are not in place, that even though that's bad for the economy and many people's mental health, we don't have to follow them. So I'm not following a specific path. Another thing I've noticed, whether it's by, I think one time Anne Helen Peterson said this on a podcast, the point that the opportunities that are available change a lot. So if she wanted to give someone advice on how to enter her career path, it's not possible anymore because journalism is not what it is in 2010 or even 2015 or whenever she was starting. That's the same for us, right? Like when I started writing for public audiences 5-6 years ago, Made by History was new. We were still in the age of academic blogs. I mean, I interned for Black Perspectives while I was writing my dissertation, which had a Black postal history component. And that was edited by Ibram Kendi and Keisha Blaine at the time. They were the people running the Zoom calls. Now they're famous people. So like the landscape shifts all the time. And if I were trying to advise like a current graduate student how to enter public writing, they can and should do it, but it looks differently from how it did when I was in graduate school. I hope that answers the question.
Absolutely.
The really short answer is I'm not sure, and that's okay.
That was a great answer. That was, as it turned out, packed with really great advice that I think everyone should heed, and especially maybe graduate students, that idea that the rules don't work anymore. And that means that you have freedom to not follow them and find your own path. I love that. Well, before I let you go, I'm going to ask my typical last question, which I always feel guilty about when someone has a brand new book coming out, because just thinking about 33 book events makes me feel sort of tired. So I'm sure that will be your focus for the next little while. But do you have something new that you're working on that you want to talk about?
I've completed a book proposal on popular memory of the American Revolution through a female millennial lens. And I'm also teaching a class on that topic at Brown University in the fall. The piece that I have not done yet is write my draft chapters. So hopefully that will happen, maybe on planes and trains to my book events. And like anything, there's always the possibility that this never happens. But I hope that the combination of having my agent has already approved my book proposal on this topic, and because I'm teaching a class where I'll get to engage with smart undergraduates, then maybe my dreams will come true.
Well, it sounds awesome. I hope your dreams do come true. I also hope that all of your dreams for Dear Miss Perkins come true as it comes out here. Dr. Rebecca Brenner-Graham, thanks so much for talking with me on Drafting the Past and talking about your writing process.
Thank you so much, Kate.
Thanks again to Rebecca for joining me and to you for listening. You can find more about this episode and all other Drafting the Past episodes at draftingthepast.com. If you enjoy the show, please share it with a friend and help spread the word. After all, friends don't let friends write boring history.